Now, you would be forgiven if you don't remember the 1992 film Memoirs of an Invisible Man. Directed by John Carpenter, it stars Chevy Chase and Daryl Hannah. Memoirs follows Nick Holloway, a stock analyst at the top of the world who accidentally becomes invisible after falling asleep during a shareholders meeting at a science lab. You know, as we all do. Leading him to now become one step ahead of the CIA agent played by a scene-stealing, pre-Merlin Sam Neill, all the while trying to find a cure and get his life back before his Diners Card membership runs out. Developed as a vehicle for Chevy Chase under the name A Cornelius Production, which happens to be Chevy Chase's real name, the production would go through 5 years, several rewrites, and a director before John Carpenter took up the mantle. When we first meet the film's main protagonist, Nick Holloway, he's still living the privileged Gordon Gekko lifestyle of the 80s. He's an orphan who's never been married, likes strong drinks, and risky bets. Nick is a man that spent his entire life avoiding responsibility and connections to other people. That is, until he meets documentarian Alice Monroe, played by Daryl Hannah. Within an hour of their first meeting, they're making out in the bathroom and setting up the next romantic rendezvous. And yet, despite the seemingly instant connection, you get a sense that for Nick, this is something that happens all the time. And even if she were special, Alice would be in a long line of broken relationships. His future ex-wife, you could say. Well, certainly that's how things would have turned out had it not been for a twist of fate that leaves Nick invisible. And by becoming invisible, Nick becomes non-existent, unable to put on display all of his external achievements. Looking back, Memoirs can be read as the embodiment of the anxieties of the Yuppie generation entering the 90s. Ah yes, the young urban professional, the embodiment of the American dream on steroids. Spawned by economic expansion, corporate culture, and fueled by ambition, greed, and excess, Yuppies forever aspired to move upward, onward, and never look back. However, by 92, most found themselves alienated in a new decade that was an increasingly technological world filled with grungy Gen Xers who had come of age and rejected all of that. But back to Nick. For him, gone are the loft apartments, champagne lifestyle, athletic club dinners, and flashcards. Stripped away of all the hallmarks of his status in the world, Nick then finds himself hunted by the government he himself never participated in, but nonetheless expected to protect his entitlement. While promoting the film, Chevy Chase stated, "It's not about the kind of situation where Claude Rains becomes invisible and went nuts, nor is it about a wacky guy who's invisible and looks up girl skirts throughout the movie. It's mostly about the perils of being invisible, not the fun or joy of it. And that's it. The perils of being invisible when you're used to privilege." As you watch the film, I argue that you could feel Nick's growing panic as he realizes he has no sort of relevance. This is most keenly felt in the scene in which Nick, while hiding out in a friend's beach house, is forced to hear his so-called friends wistfully joke about his death. Played for laughs, the film stops to open up a window into Nick's life before the accident, namely a life that was shallow, vapid, and isolating. Sam Neill's villainous agent Jenkins even remarks that Nick was invisible before the accident. Which brings me to another point. Unlike prior versions of The Visible Man, where there's an exploration of a good man's descent into madness, like in the original with Claude Rains, or a madman without limits, like in Hollow Man, or the recent retelling with Elizabeth Moss, there is no real character shift with Nick. Man loses lifestyle, man wants lifestyle back. I mean, I would too, that lifestyle was awesome. But it's not like Nick becomes a better person by the end of the film. Hell, he even figures out a way to live relatively the same way he did before, instead, this time living in a Swiss chateau, while trading stocks online. There is one silver lining, however, in his relationship with Alice. Though Nick remains basically the same person he was before, he is able to connect with one person, going from completely self-absorbed and isolated to a married man with a baby on the way, turning what could have been a throwaway hookup full circle into a touching romance. Memoirs of the Invisible Man is a zany, sometimes touching popcorn film of its time. It didn't become the star vehicle that either Chevy Chase or John Carpenter needed to launch them into the next decade. I mean, it hasn't sucked for either one of them over the last decades, but it's not the same. There was high hopes for this film at the beginning, as this was the teaming up of two of the 80s biggest powerhouses, Chase for comedy and Carpenter for horror. Except Chevy wanted this to be a drama and was hoping that this project would be a bridge to less comedic roles. In an interview, John Carpenter said, "What we tried to do with Memoirs was to show his character going through changes. Chevy didn't just want to play someone like Clark Griswold from the Vacation movies who never changes. But unfortunately, that's exactly the opposite of what audiences wanted from Chase. A zany comedy in the same vein as the characters he was known for, or at the very least, a societal horror from Carpenter. Instead, what they got was a metastatic film that asks what happens when a man on top of the world suddenly becomes invisible."